Forgive me for doing this in two parts. For some reason, I've now twice done this, touched a key, and managed to stop the video, and unable to start it again in the middle. But anyway, let's come back to the point that I was just making. Like when you think about figures in the poem, like Polyphemus, like Scyllas, like the sirens, like Circe, all of them pose either physical dangers or, more importantly, psychological dangers. But all of those dangers are also, especially the psychological ones, temptations of the mind. And so we can begin to see in this part of the journey in the Odyssey that Odysseus takes, which is really off the grid, that what he's encountering are his fears, are what he really fears, and what he's tempted by, and that he's externalizing those fears in these various figures. So let's look at some of the key points in each of the books. In Book 9, Odysseus begins his story of his journey back from Troy. And remember, too, that when you're thinking about the time frame of the poem, the poem doesn't unfold chronologically. So when we're talking about books 9 through 12, we're talking about essentially a flashback, what we would say if we were talking about a work of modern fiction. What's happening at this point? This is not happening in actual time. This is Odysseus narrating what has happened to him, to the Phaeacians. And so now we are thinking about what happens immediately after he leaves Troy, sailing away from Troy. And from Troy, Odysseus is carried west to Ismaros, a strong point on the coast. And at Ismaros, there is a repetition of the incredible violence that happened at Troy. But what happens here, they may have gotten away from Troy, but now on Ismaros, what they do is they slaughter the cattle, Helios's cattle, the cattle of the sun god. And for this act of slaughter, which was really a manifestation of greed, they are going to be punished by the god. And this greed, is followed by an incredible moment of doom. And I absolutely love, I love the lines and the way that Fitzgerald translates these lines in Book 9. He says, "They came with dawn over that terrain like the leaves and blades of spring. So doom appeared to us. The leaves and blades of spring." We must never forget when we're reading the Odyssey that we are reading a poem. And it is not just the wonders of the narrative, the narrative part of this epic, but the wonders of the language that the poet uses that are so incredible. And this is a deeply concrete language. And that language, the concreteness, the almost materiality of the language, reflects the materiality of the Greek culture as well. The Homeric culture, I should say, not so much the Greek culture, but the Homeric Greek culture. Unbelievably beautiful lines. And at this moment, Zeus sweeps them away. They were so close to home, but here they're swept away out to sea in a storm. And it's at this very moment that Odysseus glimpses Ithaca. He has this very short, very brief, almost flickering glimpse of Ithaca and home, and then he's taken away from it. And I think we can say, that it's not just that the gods are angry with Odysseus, and that's why he's swept out to sea. There's something more important, and that something more important is that Odysseus is not ready to come home. You can't be coming back to an ecos, You cannot make peace on this ecos when you are yourself still in the mood of slaughter. We could almost say, if we were reading very anachronistically, we could say that Odysseus is suffering from a kind of PTSD, and he gets to Ismaros, and almost by reflex action, he goes in and he starts again the pattern of slaughter that has been the pattern of his life for 10 years. Keep in mind the time frame. The Greeks and the Trojans are at war for 10 years. That's a long time. And if you're doing something for 10 years, right, it becomes more than this activity you're doing, right? It becomes a way of thinking. And that way of thinking is not going to work on Ithaca. It is not going to work in peacetime at all. After 9 days, right, of drifting on the sea, and you'll see all kinds of number things, 3s and 9s, right, 9 days of drifting on the sea, Odysseus and his crew reached the land of the lotus eaters. And you may know something about the lotus eaters from Tennyson's extraordinary poem of that name. But they are dangerous for a different reason. Right? They are dangerous because the lotus is that flower which induces forgetfulness. And the men may forget their desire to go home. They may forget their desire even for a sense of their singular identities. This incident is narrated only very briefly, right? Just like the incident of the slaughter of the cattle of the sun, the god of the sun. This one is very brief. And if you're not reading carefully, right, if you're not thinking about the triadic structure, you might just miss it. But now we come to the episode in Book 9 that is narrated at greater length, and that takes up the greatest part of Book 9. And that is, of course, Odysseus' experience with the Cyclops. This is an important book, an important moment in this book, episode in this book, because when we look at the world model of the Cyclops, it's a pretty bad world, right? There's no laws, right? There's really no understanding of agriculture yet, very basic understanding, no tribal customs, and the most overt sign of culture, at least for the Homeric world, is completely absent here. And that sign is shipbuilding. Right? There are no ships on the Isle of the Cyclops. There's also another problem, right? And that is that the guest-host relationship that is the primary relationship of a civilized place in the Homeric world is inverted here. And here the hosts eat the guests, right? Rather than providing food for them, they are the food. The guests become the food. So there we have, of course, the idea of cannibalism. So here you see in Book 9, right, and the cattle of the sun incident, greed, right? The lotus eaters, forgetfulness of home, and now here with the Cyclops, cannibalism, right? The loss of the physical body. There's some other key ideas, though, in that last episode that are important to recall. And maybe one of the first ones, and the most important ones, is that when Odysseus leaves the Isle of the Cyclops, he does something stupid, or we might say stupid, but he does something that is, on the one hand, stupid, and on the other hand, absolutely critical. He shouts out his name. He tells them who he is. And that's incredibly important because he has to remember who he is to tell them that information. And remembering who he is one of the reasons that he can be redirected, right, and continue on this long journey home. The Isle of the Cyclops is clearly the image of a negative home, right, or an anti-home. And it's the place that also maybe psychologically Odysseus is there. He belongs on the Isle of the Cyclops at the moment that he gets there. And now he has to get away from that island, and he has to become more and more civilized. So the journey back from Troy to Ithaca, is also a journey, a personal journey for Odysseus, who's the only one who will actually make it back, to re-enter civilization. It's a very important psychological journey, not just a physical one. In Book 10, we see that triadic structure once again. First of all, they get to Aeolia Island, the island of the Wind King. And the king gives Odysseus a bag with all the winds tied up in it, so that if his ship gets kind of stalled in the calms at sea, he can release those winds, and the winds will take him back home. But his crew, right, he goes to sleep, always a big mistake, or usually a big mistake in the Odyssey. And when he is sleeping, his crew argues, and they wonder what's in the bag, and they open it, and all the winds are released. He goes back to the Wind King and says, I'm sorry, lost the winds, can we have some more? And the Wind King says, no, you had your opportunity, no more winds for you. And he turns Odysseus out, and at this point in the poem, Odysseus is a wanderer, right? He's a wanderer and a beggar. He has nothing at all. He loses hope of Nostos, of ever getting home. He loses, again, his sense of identity just after he's cried it out to the Cyclops. And, of course, this episode is going to lead to yet another one. The second episode of the three in this book, they go to the land of the Lastrygonians. And the land of the Lastrygonians is a place where the cycle of day and night is reversed. Right? Beautiful lines again. Right? In that land, the daybreak follows dusk. If we looked at the geography and the topography of that island, the island of the Lastrygonians reminds us very much of the island of the Cyclops. So you can see the way in which the ways in which the books are talking to one another, right? The episodes in different books are talking to one another. This is a phenomenon we would call intertextuality, and a very important one, very interesting one as well. And then, of course, in the third episode of this book, Book 10, the Odysseus' ship and crew reach Circe's island. And here again, right, this is going to be the longest episode, longest of the three. And Circe is an important figure because we're going to see a real resonance between Circe, the figure of Circe, the goddess, and the figure of Penelope, the mortal wife of Odysseus. She also resembles Calypso, right, who we've already met, right, although she comes later in the poem, chronologically speaking. So when they meet Circe, Circe turns Odysseus' men into swine, not a wholly inappropriate metamorphosis given the way that they behave. And and she's a threat, right? She's a kind of psychological threat to Odysseus, whom she seduces. Right, so that seduction, she's a seductress, and in her seduction, she also rather defers his homecoming and defers his desire to go home. Okay, so if we just think about a couple of questions, thinking about books 9 and 10, one thing we might ask, right, what are all these women, especially the sort of, why, right, why are so many of the monstrous beings that Odysseus encounters in his travels home, why are they why are they female, right, and why are they so bad? And why are these threats, particularly threats to men? Why is the feminine so threatening? And some of you might want to speculate a little bit about that in a post. All right, so now we've come to Book 11. And Book 11 is such a very, very important book. In this book, as you know, right, Odysseus travels to the underworld. And the whole journey of Book 11 constitutes this extraordinary break in the narrative sequence. And that sudden break, right, as I intimated before, reflects the suddenness of death's intrusion in any life. Death is also, right, the ultimate obstacle in pursuit of a goal. You cannot reach the goal, right, if you die beforehand. And it is also, of course, the space of oblivion, right? And that oblivion is something that Odysseus fears far more than physical death. You know the details of this book probably pretty well, but I just want to point out a couple of them to you. Remember Elpenor who falls off of the roof at in Circe's island, and he comes back, right, in Book 11, and his plea to Odysseus is to be remembered, right? That he doesn't want, it's not so terrible to be dead exactly, but it is really terrible to be dead if you're also forgotten. And that sense of identity being something that is carried on after one dies through memory is very, very important to the poem. We also have Tiresias's prophecy in this book. Tiresias offers a prophecy of what will happen to Odysseus in the near future and in the distant future. And look carefully at that prophecy to see what will come to pass. Perhaps two of the most memorable, or three of the most memorable moments in this book begin with the moment when Odysseus sees his mother. Remember that Odysseus has been away more now than 10 years, been away from Ithaca more than 10 years. And sometime during those 10 years, his mother has died. And of course he doesn't know this. How would he know, right? How does the news get from Ithaca to Troy, across the seas, in the midst of a war? And so he sees his mother, and he recognizes that he has no mother anymore on the earth. And he tries to embrace her, but every time he tries to embrace her, she kind of flows away, she sort of vanishes. And that sense of not being able to have any purchase on the dead, right, not being able to hold them, to touch them again, is extremely poignant and extremely, extremely painful, and something I think we all feel even today. There's another moment, not so touching, but important, and that is the moment where Odysseus meets Agamemnon. Agamemnon, who was one of the great warriors, right, for the Greeks. And Agamemnon is also in the world of the dead, because when he came home, right, he did not have the homecoming he expected. He was in fact murdered, right, by his wife and his wife's lover. And so it's a kind of warning to Odysseus about how home may not be what you remember it as. Right? Lots of things may change in 10 years, and you'd better be prepared for some change. And finally, there is Odysseus' meeting with Achilles. And if you've read the Iliad, or you know something about Greek mythology, you will also know that Achilles was considered the greatest, right, among the greatest, Agamemnon and Achilles, right, especially Achilles, right, among the greatest of the Greek fighters. And here he is in the land of the dead. And when Odysseus sees him, he wants Achilles to reassert for him the beauty of war. And Achilles won't do it. He absolutely won't do it. So Odysseus says to him, "But was there ever a man more blessed by fortune than you, Achilles? Can there ever be? We ranked you with immortals in your lifetime, we Argives did. And here your power is royal among the dead men's shades. Think then, Achilles, you need not be so pained by death." And Achilles answers him, and it's a very, very important answer. He says, "Let me hear no smooth talk of death from you, Odysseus, light of counsels. Better, I say, to break sod as a farmhand for some poor countryman on iron rations, than lord it over all the exhausted dead." Right at that juncture, right at that moment, Achilles is saying something about the great heroic vision of war that so permeated the beginning of the Iliad. He's saying, it wasn't worth it. Glory, I'm now just among the shades. I'd rather be nobody, almost, right, but still walking on the earth. This also, first of all, it suggests this challenge to the heroic ethos of the Iliad, right, and a change in the tone of the Odyssey and in the vision of the world of the Odyssey. It's an amazing, immensely beautiful, but also immensely troubling passage, and I strongly suggest thinking about it a lot. So finally, let's think a little bit about Book 12. And when we get to book 12, we return again to that triadic structure. We have the sirens, right, who tempt Odysseus and his crew with heroic song, but he doesn't yield to that temptation. And of course, this episode is related to the Lotus Eaters. It's related to Circe, right? It's about getting Odysseus off course, making him forget home and forget the desire to get home. We also have the episode with Scylla and Charybdis, and of course the repeated motif here is cannibalism. And finally, we have again the cattle of the sun episode. And then everybody is lost, right? Everybody but Odysseus, and he is washed up on the Isle of Calypso. At the end of book 12, we are in the present, right? The flashback is over, and the poem will continue, and it will continue in a very, very different vein. So you may be wondering why I assigned such a huge number of books in the next week. And it's really because this is when you think about how the poem is structured, right, how it breaks down. It will only make sense if you read them, or it will make better sense if you read them thinking about the actual structural divisions of the poem. All right. I know there's a lot to take in, and I really appreciate your patience and your very good work. I thought that the responses for this past week were pretty good. They're going in the right direction. And I would just ask you to work on one thing, and that is finding a balance between close reading and a critical framework, right? The critical frameworks are developed largely in the lectures. I want you to understand those, right? I want the reading to be in context. But I also want you to get immersed in the reading. It's a tall order. I know that. But I also have great confidence that you are able to do it. I know you can. So balance between lecture materials and the kinds of critical contexts that those lecture materials give you, and an engagement, a very kind of visceral engagement with the language and the imagery of the poem itself. Don't be afraid to quote. I look forward very much so to your responses this week. And until then, take good care.